Chapter 14. Cousin Harry, Holly sputtered. What are you doing here? Without a word, Mr. Potter handed Holly a letter of some sort. Holly removed her mittens, letting them drop to the floor. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter. Vernon shined his light on the letter and tried to read it over her shoulder. Holly was shaking so much it was hard to read, but Vernon caught something about some sort of a charm used at 1:23 a.m. underaged wizards and the use of magic. Before Vernon could read further, Holly refolded the letter and looked up at Cousin Harry. "I'm in trouble, aren't I?" she said in a small voice. "Kind of," agreed Cousin Harry calmly. "You broke the rules," he added. "Why?" "I had to," Holly blurted. "I was locked in the garage and I couldn't find another way out. That was okay. It wasn't all that bad inside, and I knew getting caught was one of the risks. But Vernon was stuck outside where it was worse. He couldn't get me out on his own and was going to try to find help. I knew he couldn't get over the wall alone with that arm, and I couldn't let him get into trouble just because of me. I mean, it was all my fault, not his." Her words came out in a rush. Cousin Harry listened without comment. "Why were you outside in the first place?" he asked when she quit talking. Holly was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke again. "I had to free the cats," she said with emotion. "The guy was caging stray cats and selling them to dog trainers," she added, explaining further. "I see," said Cousin Harry, his face betraying absolutely no emotion. "And you think it's better that the cats suffer and eventually die through disease, neglect, cold, and starvation?" he asked. Sputtered Holly, who clearly had not considered the life of a stray cat before. "Well, at least they're not being terrorized and tortured to death by vicious dogs," she said defensively. Said Cousin Harry. He turned, vanishing into the shadows of the garage, and reappeared momentarily carrying 2 mugs. An enticing odor of hot cocoa wafted up from them. "Here," he said quietly, while handing one mug to Vernon and the other to Holly. "Drink up," he commanded. "It'll help warm you. Both of you look like you could use it." Vernon gulped down, and immediately a warming sensation flowed throughout his body. He drank some more gratefully. Holly did the same. How? Vernon suddenly wondered. Had Cousin Harry managed to warm it up in a garage during the middle of a power outage? Are you going to tell Dad?" asked Holly fearfully when she'd finished her cocoa. "No," came the quiet reply. Holly seemed to visibly relax at that. Then Cousin Harry added, "You're going to." "What?" protested Holly, nearly dropping her mug in surprise. "I seem to recall you telling me that you haven't done anything you would be ashamed to tell your dad should he ask," said Cousin Harry sternly. "Were you lying?" No, sir," came Holly's shaky response. "Then I believe now is the time to demonstrate your sincerity. I expect you to tell your father everything tomorrow morning," he continued, "and I mean everything." Holly practically cringed at that last word. "Do you understand?" Yes, sir," said Holly meekly. Cousin Harry nodded, satisfied with her response. "Now," he directed, reaching out to take their empty mugs, "both of you get to bed while you still have a chance to rest." "Yes, sir," mumbled Holly. She bent down and grabbed her mittens and torch. Moving to the entrance, she hastily opened the kitchen door. Vernon followed as she quickly went into the kitchen, closing the door behind them. "What'd you do?" he whispered to her as they walked. I used magic to get out of the house," Holly whispered guiltily. She stopped to pull off her wet hat and scarf and tucked them with her mittens under her free arm. "So?" replied Vernon, confused. He started removing his own wet things. "Isn't that what you're learning at that school of yours?" "Yes," agreed Holly, "but I'm not supposed to practice magic anywhere except at Hogwarts." "Oh," said Vernon. "Bummer. So how'd they know?" "I don't know," replied Holly, "but they did." "What are you going to do?" Vernon had been willing to try forging Dad's signature rather than tell him when school put him on probation last year. But at least he'd been falsely accused. This had to be 10 times worse. Holly was actually guilty. "Tell Dad tomorrow, I guess," she said bleakly, somehow. Holly started for her room. She stopped in front of her door and added, "Cousin Harry'll know if I don't, and if Dad finds out I was supposed to tell him something and didn't, I'll screw up my chances of returning to Hogwarts for sure." "How's your arm?" she asked, changing the subject. "Do you need help getting changed?" No," replied Vernon thoughtfully. "I think I can manage. "How'd you know about it anyway?" he asked. "I never said a word about it." "You didn't have to, silly," whispered Holly with a ghost of a smile on her face. "I'm an empath, remember? I felt it when it happened." She opened her bedroom door and paused. "You might want to take some pain medicine before you go to bed," she advised. "It might help you sleep better." "Good night," she added, stepping in her room. "Thanks for coming with me. I don't think I could have done it alone." Vernon nodded. He almost said, "Any time," but bit his tongue in time. To be honest, he never again wanted to go traipsing out into the middle of a snowstorm just to rescue some cats. "Good night," he replied instead. Sis," he added. Holly paused. "Good luck tomorrow." "Thanks," said Holly, and she closed the door to her room. Vernon entered his own bedroom and changed his mind, heading instead for the medicine cabinet. Using his torch, he rummaged around looking for something for the pain. He decided it might be a good idea to take something before trying to sleep. Back in his room, Vernon hastily changed out of his wet things and jumped under the covers. Despite the pain, he was exhausted and had no difficulty getting to sleep. The power was still out when Laurel Wycliffe got up the next morning. She lit the portable gas stove she had gotten out the previous evening and put on a pot of hot water for tea. A while later, Dylan came in the kitchen and announced that the fire had been lit. Soon the house would warm up a bit. Laurel poured Dylan and herself a cup of tea. The two sat at the table and watched the weather outside. The wind had died considerably, but it was still snowing. "I don't think I'll be going into work today," announced Dylan. Laurel nodded in agreement. It was not a good day to try to negotiate the roads. When they finished the tea, Laurel put on a big pot and heated some more water. Dylan found the telephone and called the people at work to let them know he wouldn't be coming in. He reported that nearly everyone else had done the same, so the office would be shutting down for the day. When the water was hot, Laurel fixed some oatmeal for breakfast. "Vernon! Holly!" she called out when it was ready. "Breakfast! Come and get it while it's hot." After a while, Vernon and Holly appeared and sat down. Both of them looked bleary-eyed and sleepy. "Bad night?" Laurel asked sympathetically. "That wind was pretty loud, wasn't it?" "There was, a branch that kept banging on my window," admitted Vernon. Laurel set the food down, and the whole family sat together and ate breakfast. It was a pretty quiet meal. When everyone had finished, Vernon vanished to the other room while Laurel cleared away the table. She started doing the dishes when Holly spoke up. Daddy," began Holly tentatively, "can I speak with you for a minute?" "Sure, baby," said Dylan. "What is it?" "Alone?" Both Dylan and Laurel looked closer at Holly. Her face was pale and her voice was rather quiet. What was up? Why don't I check on the fire in the other room?" said Laurel, wiping her hands dry and excusing herself quickly. She left the kitchen, quietly shutting the door behind her. She'd find out later from Dylan what Holly had to say. "I wonder what that's all about," said Laurel to no one in particular while she was rummaging by the sofa getting her crocheting. She was making an afghan. Without electricity, the lighting in the house was rather poor, but she could see well enough to crochet. She sat down and started looping the crochet hook around the yarn and through the afghan. Suddenly, Laurel heard an explosive "What?" from Dylan. Laurel jumped in her seat, dropping her things. Didn't sound good in there. She stood to go to the kitchen to investigate. "We kind of went out last night," came Vernon's quiet voice, stopping Laurel in her tracks. The statement was so odd, Laurel didn't believe what she'd heard. Who would have been dumb enough to go out on a night like last night? "What do you mean?" she asked. Laurel turned to Vernon for further explanation. But Vernon was sitting in a chair with his eyes glued to his electronic game. For a moment, Laurel thought she'd been mistaken in what she'd heard. She sat uncertainly down and picked up her crocheting. "Who?" came another explosive shout from the kitchen. Laurel jumped up again and practically ran to the kitchen. Her hand was on the knob to open it when Vernon suddenly said, "Cousin Harry kind of caught us." That stopped Laurel in her tracks. If Cousin Harry was involved, that must mean something related to magic. Dylan was touchy about anything related to magic. Laurel found it best to keep out of the way when it came to magic and Harry Potter. "In the garage? Now?" Laurel abandoned her attempts to go into the kitchen and instead headed for the garage door. "I wouldn't look in there if I were you," said Vernon, his eyes still glued to the game. but he was clearly not playing. Laurel ignored Vernon and opened the door to the garage. A chorus of loud yowls greeted her. Laurel slammed the door shut before anything could get out and leaned against the door. She took several deep breaths, straightened, and walked back into the living room. "I think," she began, addressing Vernon directly, "that you should tell me exactly what you and Holly were up to last night." Vernon looked up wordlessly from his game. His green eyes stared back at Laurel, and she added, "Everything." About an hour later, the loud noises from the kitchen finally subsided. Not that Laurel Wycliffe had been listening. She'd been making quite a bit of noise herself with Vernon. To think that her 2 kids had been out in that raging storm, breaking into other people's places, it boggled the mind. They could have been caught. They could have died. The door to the kitchen opened, and Dillon finally came out. He stomped over to the garage door and opened it. A chorus of yowls sounded out loudly at his presence. Without a word, Dillon slammed the door shut. He stomped into the living room and stopped in front of Laurel. She was crocheting again. This wasn't something she could handle alone. She had to wait for Dillon to finish with Holly before they could decide what to do. Laurel stopped crocheting and looked up at Dillon. Dillon looked furious, ready to explode at any minute. "Do you?" he began. He tried again. "Did you know? Have you any idea what our kids did last night?" he finally burst out. "Yes," said Laurel simply, while trying to hide the turmoil inside. "Vernon just told me," she added quickly, before Dillon could explode and accuse her of hiding this. Dillon looked venomously at Vernon. "You!" he spat. "Go to your room now. And you, too," he added, shouting at Holly. "You're both grounded until further notice." Vernon got up, game in hand. "Leave the game here," said Laurel quietly. Vernon put the game down without a word and headed off to his room. Holly reappeared from the kitchen. She was very pale. She wiped her nose with her sleeve and looked as if she'd been crying. She, too, walked to her room without a word. Dillon opened his mouth and looked at Laurel as if he were about to say something. Then he closed his mouth, stomped off to the bedroom, and slammed the door shut. Laurel put down her crocheting. She went into the kitchen and started putting together a soup for lunch. They couldn't do anything about Holly and Vernon until Dillon cooled off enough to discuss things. Laurel had just gotten things to simmer when Dillon stormed into the kitchen. He was still angry, but at least he was more coherent. "Do you still have that book of yours?" he thundered. He didn't have to explain further. There was only one book that Dillon referred to with such loathing. "Yes," replied Laurel calmly. "Well," commanded Dillon, "I want you to write Harry and tell him I want to meet him right away." "Now?" questioned Laurel. "Yes, now," he stormed. "But it's snowing outside, and the roads are all closed," protested Laurel. "You can't ask him to come out here in this kind of weather." That stopped Dillon, but only for a moment. He glanced outside and stared at the snow for a bit and then spat. "He made it here last night. He can bally well make it here in the daytime for me, and you can tell him I said that, too." "Yes, dear," said Laurel meekly. Dillon turned and stomped out of the kitchen, slamming the door as he left. Laurel gave the soup a final stir. Then she set the spoon down and went to the pantry. She dug around and pulled out that turquoise book Harry Potter had given her. She wrote a brief message inside, not the one Dillon had suggested, something a little more polite in the form of a request. By the speed with which a response occurred, Laurel suspected Harry had been waiting around for just such a message. Laurel found Dillon in the living room. He had an open magazine in hand, but he wasn't reading. He was just staring blankly out at the falling snow. "Harry says he'll be here in 15 minutes, Laurel told Dillon. "Is that okay?" Dillon gave no indication of having heard her and continued to stare outside. Well, thought Laurel, at least that wasn't a no. She went back into the kitchen, took the soup off the stove, and put the kettle of water on for tea. The portable stove only had one burner. Then Laurel rummaged around in the cupboards for something to serve with it. They were having company, after all. Exactly 15 minutes later, there came a soft knock at the door. Laurel quickly pulled back her brown hair with a kerchief. She came out of the kitchen and hurried to the front door. Dillon was nowhere to be seen. Laurel opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Wycliffe," said the tall figure standing outside. He was dressed warmly with a coat, hat, and a thick scarf. "Hello, Mr. Potter," greeted Laurel in return. Won't you come in?" "Thank you," he replied, stepping inside. "Let me take your wraps for you," offered Laurel, "unless you'd rather keep them on. We've had a power outage here, and I'm afraid it isn't the warmest inside." "I think I can manage," replied Harry, taking off his hat and scarf and handing them to Laurel. "Thank you for your help. Is, Dylan in?" he inquired politely. "Yes," said Laurel, "he is." Laurel looked around for him. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the kitchen door swing shut. "He's in the kitchen," she replied. "It's warmer there. Why don't you follow me?" she suggested, leading the way. "Thank you," said Harry quietly. He followed Laurel into the kitchen. Dylan sat at the table. He looked up at Harry and glared menacingly. "This is not going to be easy," thought Laurel. "Won't you have a seat?" she suggested out loud to Harry, pointing to a chair. "Thank you," said Harry politely, sitting down in the seat indicated. "And some tea?" she added. "Would you like some tea? That should warm you up a bit." "Yes, please," replied Harry. He turned and watched her make the tea. "Thank you," he murmured when she set the cup down in front of him. Laurel nodded. "I've some cookies, too," added Laurel, while she poured a second cup of tea and set it in front of Dylan. "Would you like some biscuits?" She poured a third cup for herself. "I don't think that will be necessary," replied Harry. He held the teacup with both hands, warming them while he sipped. Dylan left his tea untouched. Laurel took her cup and set it down on the counter in a corner of the kitchen, away from the table. She quietly moved a chair to the corner and sat down as unobtrusively as possible. This wasn't her conversation, but it affected both her children, and she had no intention of leaving the room. "You know why I want you here?" asked Dylan suddenly, without any preamble. "Yeah, I guess," replied Harry. "She broke the rules." "How do you know?" "I got a letter." "Why?" "Why? Yeah, why?" "Because she broke the rules. I said that already." "No," said Dylan impatiently. "Why did the letter come to you?" "I'm her legal guardian, remember?" said Harry. "In all matters magical." "While at Hogwarts," finished Dylan, spitting out that last word. It was the first time Laurel had ever heard Dylan mention the name Hogwarts. "She's not at Hogwarts, Harry," Dylan continued. "Why did you get the letter?" Harry stared at Dylan in surprise. Even Laurel looked at him with new understanding. She hadn't realized part of Dylan's anger stemmed from the fact that Harry had been involved in what should have been essentially a family problem. "I guess," said Harry slowly, "because that's the only address they have for Holly." "What?" "I never told them where you lived, Dudley," explained Harry further. "It wasn't necessary at the time, and I never did it later," he added. "I didn't think you'd want them to know." "Oh," replied Dylan. Much of the anger went out of him instantly. It was like a balloon had suddenly deflated. "I don't," he confirmed in a quieter voice. Dylan took a sip of tea and then set the cup down again. "So how come they knew about her?" he finally asked, "and what she did?" "Perhaps because she didn't do it here," replied Harry thoughtfully. "You mean we're still protected? They can't find us?" inquired Dylan anxiously. "I don't believe so," came the reply. "Oh." Dylan thought about that a bit and then spoke again. What if she does it here? Would they know?" "I don't know," replied Harry carefully. "We could always ask Holly in and have her try an experiment." "No," said Dylan vehemently while giving a shudder. "Of course not," agreed Harry. "What are they going to do? I mean to Holly for what she did?" inquired Dylan anxiously. "They," decided Laurel to herself, "must be the school or the Ministry of Magic that Holly had mentioned a few times." "They already did it," replied Harry promptly. "They sent a nasty note to Holly, through me, making all kinds of horrible threats should she continue to do what she did. A note, I might add, which I already gave to her, which you evidently now know about. It's a first-time offense," he added. "The actual discipline is left up to the parents. That would be you, I believe," Harry added dryly. He pushed his cup and saucer forward and scooted his chair back. "And that," Harry said while standing up, "should conclude my part of this business. You and Laurel can handle the rest on your own." "Not exactly," said Dylan ominously. Harry froze. "What do you mean?" he asked. "There's the matter of what Holly and Vernon were doing last night when she did, whatever she did that brought her to their attention." "That's between you and your kids, isn't it?" said Harry, confused. "Surely it's none of my business." "Ordinarily, I would agree," replied Dylan, "but unfortunately, My daughter informs me that as long as the neighbor continues to cage cats, she's going to try to let them go using any way possible, including you know what, if necessary. Though she claims, he added, she'll use that as a last resort. Laurel drew in a swift intake of breath at this news. That was something Vernon hadn't mentioned. I see, said Harry slowly. How serious is she? He asked. I mean, as this is her first time, maybe we can persuade her to... Actually, interrupted Dylan, this isn't her first time. It's her third. Oh, said Harry solemnly. A repeat offender, he mused while sitting back down. Wouldn't the Daily Prophet love to learn about that? I don't want anyone learning about that, said Dylan angrily. I have talked to her, yelled, pleaded, begged, ordered, threatened, everything. And she is still adamant. This is all your fault, Harry. You've got to help me take care of it. Mine, said Harry in surprise. How do you figure that? You raised her, not me. You got her that dang cat, retorted Dylan. If you hadn't gotten her that cat, we wouldn't be in this fix today. Had to, said Harry promptly. The healer said a cat was an absolute necessity for an untrained empath. Oh, said Dylan glumly. And now I've got an animal activist on my hand. He gulped down some tea and then spoke. I don't want Holly doing this again, Harry, but I can't keep a 24-hour watch on her while she's here either. We could lock her in like my dad, but I don't want to. Even if I did, if what you're saying about her being able to use you-know-what in the house without getting caught is true, and she figures this out, there'll be no stopping her. Worse, she tells me the neighbor has been improving his security. She's going to get caught again for sure, or become a very good cat burglar, finished Harry wryly. Laurel looked over at Harry. Was that glint a twinkle in his eye? He has a sense of humor, she thought in astonishment. Very funny, complained Dylan. This is serious, Harry. What'll we do? It would seem, said Harry thoughtfully, that we must remove the temptation. Yeah, right, said Dylan derisively. Like how? Walk up to the guy's house and say, Excuse me, but could you stop collecting cats because my daughter is going to keep on setting them free? I was thinking of maybe something a little less obvious, replied Harry slowly. What, one of those memory things you wanted to do with my parents? Snorted Dylan. I don't want your people anywhere near my place for any reason, and I certainly don't want them messing around with my neighbors. Actually, said Harry thoughtfully, I doubt they'd approve of such a request, and I'd probably be in trouble if I attempted it myself. What we need is something without you-know-what. At that moment, the familiar sound of the refrigerator whirling indicated the power had just come on. Laurel got up and hastily turned off the portable stove and transferred her soup to the regular stove. The soup was pretty much done anyway, but she wanted to keep it warm. Ah, said Harry, excellent timing. He leaned back. Mrs. Wycliffe, he began. Laurel, he said tentatively. He'd never actually referred to her by first name before. Would you be so good as to ask Holly to come here? I'd like a word with her, if I may. He glanced over at Dylan, looking for his consent. Yeah, sure, go right on ahead, he said, waving his hand dismissively. See if you can get anywhere with her. Laurel left the kitchen. She soon returned with Holly following behind. Holly was pale, but she held her head up defiantly. Her curly blonde hair had already begun to grow out and was now shoulder-length, with only a touch of wave in it. Sit down, said Harry pleasantly, indicating a chair at the table. Holly sat down warily. Laurel hastily poured her a cup of tea and refreshed everyone else's cup. Then she sat back down in the corner. Holly ignored the tea and kept her green eyes focused on Harry. We've been discussing, last night, began Harry. No one here wants a repeat of that little escapade. Holly started to speak, but Harry held up a hand to silence her. However noble your intentions may be, he continued, it should have surely occurred to you by now that apart from discouraging your neighbor from collecting cats, your efforts have only served to strengthen his resolve. If you wish him to stop catching cats, you must find another way. But I already told Dad, exploded Holly. There's no other way. What he's doing isn't illegal. Perhaps not, agreed Harry calmly. But I noticed as I passed his house this morning that there was no sign advertising his business either. That would seem to indicate that while selling stray cats may be legal, perhaps he is doing something else that isn't so legal. It occurs to me, suggesting Laurel, catching on to what Harry was saying, that it doesn't seem right for him to be selling cats in a residential neighborhood. Maybe he isn't declaring the income he derives from the sale of the cats to the government, added Dylan, warming to Harry's idea. Some very good judges have come from your house, Holly, added Harry sternly. There must be a reason. Find us some laws your neighbor is breaking, something that we can use. Holly's face lost some of its defiance as she pondered their words. Yes, sir, I'll try, she agreed, standing up. This is not a try situation, reminded Harry. If you can't find anything, then you may be spending your summers chained to the bedpost, and I'll provide the locks. Yes, sir, said Holly with more determination. Can Vernon help? He's better with computers than me. That would be an excellent idea, agreed Harry. Holly left the kitchen quickly with a bounce in her step. Dylan pushed his cup and saucer away. What now? Now, said Laurel briskly before anyone else said anything. We have some lunch. You are staying for lunch, Harry. We insist, don't we, dear? She looked over at Dylan for confirmation. Yeah, he said, looking distinctly uncomfortable at the prospect of a meal with Harry Potter, but unable to figure a way out of it. I guess we have to wait around to see what the kids come up with anyway, he added. Then it's settled, said Laurel. You both just wait and I'll have food on the table in a few minutes. You don't mind a hearty pea soup, do you? She inquired of Harry. No, ma'am, replied Harry. A pea soup sounds positively delicious, especially if that's what I've been smelling all morning. It is, confirmed Laurel conversationally. She swiftly removed the cups and saucers and wiped off the table. Then she placed some plates and bowls on the table. Then Laurel dished up 2 bowls of soup and put them on a tray. I'll just take these over to Holly and Vernon so they can eat while they work. They're both grounded, you know, she added. And then we'll be ready to eat. A few minutes later, Laurel returned and filled the bowls on the table. Everyone began eating. What do you plan to do about last night? Asked Harry after he'd taken a few bites. I mean with Holly and Vernon. They're going to clean out my garage, growled Dylan, as soon as we can get those cats out. They're going to have to do a bit more than that, added Laurel angrily. Those 2 have terrorized the neighborhood with their vandalism. We didn't know about the cat part, she added, for Harry's benefit. But everyone's been worried which house would be next, she continued. And the damage and destruction they've caused, that's got to be repaid. Well, we can't hand the neighbors some money, stated Dylan. Then they'd know our children were responsible, and they'd call the authorities. I don't want our kids going to jail. I don't either, agreed Laurel. But they've still got to pay for what they did, somehow. What followed was a spirited discussion on how the children should repay their debt, what they should do, whether each should repay equally, or should Holly do more, as she was the instigator, or should Vernon do more because he should have managed to keep Holly home. Upon reflection, Laurel realized the whole conversation took place as if Harry wasn't there. True, it was not a topic that concerned Harry, but Laurel was amazed at how easily Dylan could ignore Harry's presence, and how Harry let him, accepting the rude treatment as if it were normal. The conversation drew to a standstill after a while, when both Laurel and Dylan agreed that shoveling snow would be the most visible means of helping the neighborhood and repaying their debt, but couldn't agree on who should do the bulk of the work. Vernon, argued Laurel, has a sprained wrist and a bruised shoulder. He can't be expected to do strenuous work. But Holly is too young, too fragile, countered Dylan. She's never done anything like that. We can't ask her to do the shoveling either. She doesn't know how. We'll have to think of something else. Actually, I understand Holly's already had a bit of practice with a shovel, spoke up Harry. Dylan gave a start at Harry's words, as if noticing him for the first time. Since when? Argued Dylan. Since last year, came the brief reply. As usual, Harry did not elaborate. Laurel cleared her throat while she phrased her question. She knew Harry well enough by now to be fairly certain he wouldn't lie when asked a direct question, but it had to be the right question. Why was she shoveling? She finally asked. It was a detention, replied Harry calmly. What? Exploded Dylan protectively. Your lot had my baby shoveling snow last year? Why? What'd she do? She left the school grounds after hours without permission, if I recall correctly, answered Harry blandly. It was totally a school matter, so there was no need to involve you. Or me, he added quickly, before Dylan could rant about the lack of notification. So how do you know about it? Inquired Laurel. My sons told me, Harry replied. So my daughter was put to work shoveling just for being out after hours? The idea of a detention, reminded Harry, is to ensure the infraction never occurs again. To the best of my knowledge, Holly has never again left the school grounds without express permission, so it seems to have worked. His voice trailed off, as if he suddenly realized that Laurel and Dylan's own discussion centered around Holly having done much the same thing. At least at school, Harry amended. Dylan looked down at his now empty bowl. Right, he said finally. I guess if it worked at school, we can try it here too. Holly will do most of the shoveling. Laurel nodded in agreement. Privately, she made a note to herself to ask Holly more about that detention. She had a feeling Harry left a lot unsaid. Excuse me. Everyone looked up at the voice. Holly stood at the doorway of the kitchen. Yes? I think maybe we found something. Holly handed Harry some papers marked with a yellow highlight pen. Harry looked at them carefully. Yes, said Harry thoughtfully, I think these might do. He handed the papers to Dylan. Dylan read through them and then handed the papers to Laurel. There seems to be only one problem, added Harry. These laws would only apply should the person in question actually have some cats in his residence, and I believe he has none at the moment. Holly shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Do you think you could convince the cats to return? It would only be for a brief time until we can contact the authorities. Yes, sir, replied Holly uncertainly. I think so. Perhaps you could get started on that now. Yes, sir. Holly nodded and turned to leave. And when you're done, called out Dylan. Holly paused and Dylan finished his sentence. I want you and Vernon back here so we can talk. Yes, sir. Holly closed the door to the garage and walked to Vernon's room. It hadn't been easy, but with Sasha's help she had managed to convince the cats to return to the other house. Holly hadn't wanted to, but if they waited until summer, more cats would be caught and killed. In the end, Holly had accompanied the cats over to the other yard. She stood behind a tree watching their return. The cat man had already put out some tins of cat food to attract cats, so she knew that they would soon be caught and returned to the cages. They'd been too strong for Holly to crush alone during her midnight visit. She hoped this plan worked. Holly knocked on Vernon's door and then entered without waiting for an answer. Vernon was lying on the bed. His injured wrist had been neatly wrapped with a bandage. It didn't hurt him nearly as much as it had when he woke this morning, nor did his shoulder. Holly could sense Vernon was pretty depressed. Holly didn't blame him. She had always been prepared for the possibility of getting found out, but not Vernon. Holly never intended to get him in trouble. This hadn't been his fight. Holly had already apologized to Vernon numerous times, but it hadn't helped him feel better. She would have to do something special for Vernon to make up for this. Vernon looked up at her entrance. Where have you been? He asked without enthusiasm. I've been returning the cats, replied Holly. So they think it'll work? Yeah. Mum and Dad want to see us, Holly added. I think it's about last night. Great, said Vernon dejectedly. He rolled slowly out of bed. Well, he sighed, at least they've stopped yelling. Holly nodded. Dad's emotions when Holly broke the news had been as strong as his voice was loud. Even while blocking, Dad's anger had almost totally consumed Holly. And then when Mum started in on Vernon, Holly felt every bit of it, even though Mum was on the other side of the door. It had been difficult to keep hold of her own feelings while being assaulted with such strong emotions on both sides. Holly and Vernon both felt like condemned prisoners walking to their doom as they made their way to the kitchen. Cousin Harry and Dad were seated at the table, in much the same places as they were when Holly had last seen them, except now the luncheon dishes had been cleared away. Mum sat with them, and a plate of cookies lay on the table in front of them. Cousin Harry was idly stirring his tea with a spoon when they entered. He looked up at their arrival. They all looked up. Holly cleared her throat nervously. You wanted to see us? She began hesitantly. Yes, said Mum. What you two did last night was wrong. We don't want you doing something like that ever again. Yes, Mum, said Vernon meekly. Holly remained silent. She kept her head up and her eyes steady, but she wasn't really listening. Yes, it was wrong to enter the guy's place at night, but in her mind, torturing and killing cats was even more wrong. She'd do whatever they made her do, But if this idea didn't work, she'd be back at the Catman's place this summer. She just would have to make sure Vernon wasn't around when she did anything. It hadn't been fair that he'd had to get punished along with her. "I want you to clean up the garage," Dad's voice broke into Holly's thoughts. "And when you're done," he continued, "I don't want it to smell anything at all like," he fumbled for the right word, "like cat." "But before you do that," broke in Mum hastily, "you're going to repay what you have taken from this neighborhood. I want you and Vernon to bundle up and visit each and every neighbor on this street. Check to see if they're okay. Run any errands that they may need. Help with repairs. And shovel their driveways," interjected Dad. "Holly," he growled accusingly, "I understand you're pretty good with a shovel now." Holly felt her face warm with embarrassment. Cousin Harry must have told them about that. She wondered how much of last year's detention he had mentioned. "Ask first," added Mum, "and if they say yes, you'll do it at no charge, and I want you to do all the sidewalks, too." "Everything?" moaned Vernon in anticipation. There were a lot of houses on the street. "Yes, everything," replied Mum. "Normally, I would march the two of you up to the neighbor in question and have you apologize in person and offer to make restitution. Unfortunately, that might land you in jail. We thought this might be a way you can repay the neighborhood without the prison time. But if you prefer, we can let you apologize instead." "No, that's okay," mumbled Vernon, immediately backing down. "We'll get it done," said Holly firmly. At least it was only snow this time. "Are the cats with the neighbor?" broke in the voice of Cousin Harry, changing the topic. "Yes," replied Holly, "but I don't think he's caught them all yet." "I'll contact the authorities about him if you wish," he said to Dad. "That way it won't get traced back to you." Yes," said Dad uncomfortably. Thank you, Harry." "I'd best be going then," Cousin Harry said, standing up. Mum and Dad stood up too. "Thank you for a wonderful meal," he said to Mum. "You're welcome," she said with a smile. "Thank you for coming." "You'll want your things," she added. "I'll just fetch them for you." She moved quickly past Holly and Vernon to the entryway. "Goodbye, Dylan," said Cousin Harry, and he nodded towards Dad. Bye," said Dad. Harry walked out of the kitchen, stopping briefly when he drew near Holly and Vernon. "It was nice seeing you again," he said to Vernon. "I hope your wrist recovers soon." Vernon looked down at his bandaged wrist. "Me too," he replied, not sure what else to say. And to Holly, Cousin Harry added in a low voice, "I hope that Vernon's injury won't get any worse because of this." "No, sir," agreed Holly sincerely, meeting his green eyes squarely with her own. She would monitor Vernon's pain levels to make sure. Cousin Harry nodded briefly and then continued on his way to the door. Mum handed him his wraps. Cousin Harry put them on and then said goodbye one last time before leaving. An hour later, the snow finally stopped falling. Shovel in hand, Vernon found himself tramping through the snow with Holly, making their way to the Rogers house across the street. Yes, they were all fine, and no, they didn't need anything, but that would be terrific if they would shovel the snow from their driveway. While the other children were out tossing snowballs at each other, Vernon and Holly worked hard shoveling snow. When they got to the third house, Holly suddenly quickened her step and insisted Vernon hurry and bang on the windows, looking for the occupant. Vernon finally saw the foot of somebody while looking in the bedroom window. The person was on the floor and looked injured, or worse. By the time Vernon found Holly, she was already opening the garage door in the hopes that there was an access into the house through the kitchen door. Fortunately, the kitchen door opened easily. Holly and Vernon rushed in. Mr. Beckworth, the owner of the house, had fallen and broken his hip. He was still alive, but very cold and in a great deal of pain. The fall had happened when he had gotten up to turn on the heat after the power came back on. He had been unable to move much since the injury. Vernon got on the phone immediately to call for an ambulance. Of course, the roads were still blocked, but they promised they would come as soon as they could. In the meantime, Vernon helped Holly get Mr. Beckworth into bed. Vernon turned up the heat while Holly fixed some tea and warmed some food to give him. They kept Mr. Beckworth as comfortable as possible while they waited for help to arrive. Holly decided she'd better make sure everyone else in the neighborhood was okay and let Mum and Dad know where they were. She insisted Vernon stay with Mr. Beckworth while she checked the other houses. Privately, Vernon thought it was a bit boring waiting around with Mr. Beckworth, but it was much better than shoveling snow, and his wrist had begun to ache. Holly brought back a small bag from their house when she returned. Then she pulled a tube out of the bag. She unwrapped Vernon's bandage and rubbed some of the ointment from the tube onto his wrist. "There," she said, rewrapping his wrist. "Does that feel better?" Yeah, it does," replied Vernon, surprised that the ache had diminished considerably. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked her. "Was that something from school?" "No," replied Holly. "Actually, I got it from some of Grandmom's papers on Mum's side," she explained. "She was a midwife during the war. Mum thought there might be something in them I could use for the school contest." "I thought that was a cooking contest," commented Vernon. Actually, it's a potions contest," confessed Holly, "but I didn't dare say that in front of Grandmom." "Oh," said Vernon. "Grandmom's papers have been pretty interesting reading, and there were lots of home remedies, but not a lot of them qualify as potions," added Holly sorrowfully. "Say," suggested Vernon, "maybe you could use that anti-curse potion you made up last year. It sure worked for me." Holly laughed, remembering the mixture of mustard and pepper she had concocted to help get her brother's name cleared. "I might just do that," she agreed, "if I can just remember all the ingredients." The ambulance didn't arrive until after dinner. By then it was dark and too late to continue shoveling snow. The next day it was back to shoveling snow. This time, however, it was sprinkled with lots of cookie and hot cocoa breaks. Word spread swiftly around the neighborhood how Holly and Vernon had helped Mr. Beckworth, probably saving his life. Everyone was eager to shower the local heroes with all sorts of compliments and gifts to show their appreciation. That made the shoveling much easier. Holly and Vernon finished shoveling the driveways and all the sidewalks by the end of the third day. Both were looking forward to a much-welcomed rest from shoveling. They did not shovel the driveway of the place where the Catman lived. His house stood empty and the front gate locked tight. There had been no one from whom to ask permission. Vernon got the story when he was shoveling Ben's driveway. Ben was the same age as Vernon, and Ben's mum insisted Ben helped with the shoveling of their driveway. They naturally got to talking while they shoveled. Vernon and Ben used to catch cats together and sell them to Mr. Scott, the Catman. That was before Vernon's mum had found out and put a stop to the venture. Ben still caught cats for the Catman. In fact, Mr. Scott had asked Ben over for help right after the big snowstorm. According to Ben, Mr. Scott said the cats had somehow gotten out during the storm, but the weather was so bad they hadn't strayed far. Ben was put to work setting out food and recatching the cats. Ben caught quite a few the first day. He returned the next to get more and receive payment for his help. Sometime late that morning, an official-looking car had driven up. Its occupants got out and asked to see the owners of the property. As Mr. Scott was right outside in plain sight working, he couldn't help but talk with them, and Ben couldn't help but listen in. "Are you selling cats?" they asked him. Well, the guy couldn't deny that, seeing as the garage door was open at the time and all the cats in their cages were showing. "Do you have a license to sell cats?" "Of course," replied Mr. Scott. "I'll just go inside and get it." And Mr. Scott went into the house to get his license. But he never came out again. The officials waited a long time for his return, as did Ben, who had not yet been paid. Finally, one of the guys started banging on the door to see what was taking so long. The other man made his way through the snow to the back of the house and started shouting loudly. Apparently, Mr. Scott had slipped out a back window. The tracks showed he had made a beeline in the opposite direction and climbed over his own fence, making good his departure. The two officials attempted to follow the tracks, but came back empty-handed. That meant the cats had been abandoned. An hour later, a truck arrived. All the cages filled with cats were removed and taken to a nearby animal shelter. Vernon knew that part of the story from his personal observation. Holly had stopped her shoveling to watch solemnly as the cats were removed and driven away. "Don't worry," he assured her. "They'll be okay. They'll be fed and cared for and get new homes." Holly nodded. "I hope so," she said softly, and returned to shoveling. A few nights later, Vernon heard on the news that the authorities were seeking a person in connection with gambling, money laundering, and organizing dogfights. The name was different, but Vernon recognized the photo they showed on the news as that of Mr. Scott, the Catman. Holly figured he had been selling cats to dog trainers. She just hadn't known all the other illegal activities he had been engaged in. That last evening, when they had finished all the driveways and sidewalks, the two returned wearily home to find a visitor waiting for them. It was the daughter of Mr. Beckworth. Maureen Beckworth Stanton. She stopped by to report that her father was doing well in the hospital and to thank the two of them for helping him. I don't know what he would have done if you two hadn't stopped by and helped when you did, she said gratefully. I'm just glad we could help, said Holly shyly. This is for you, said Maureen. She handed Vernon a small, flat package wrapped with a bow. Vernon's eyes lit up when he opened it. Gee, thanks, he said happily. It contained a new video game, the one he had planned to get with his grandparents' Christmas money. How did you know? Maureen laughed. Your mum told me you had your eye on it for a while, she said. And this is for you, continued Maureen, handing Holly a small rectangular package, also wrapped with a bow. I hope you like it, she added as Holly opened it. Within was a small leather-bound book filled with spidery handwriting, a journal of some sort. It looked very old. Dad said he overheard you and Vernon talking about potions and such, continued Maureen. He wanted to give you this. It's his grandfather's. He was a doctor at the turn of the century. I'm not very good with needles and things, she confessed, but Dad said you were so gentle. You knew just what to do so he wouldn't hurt so much. He thinks you should become a doctor. I know it's not a very conventional gift, but do you like it? Maureen asked anxiously. Holly looked up at Maureen. It's wonderful, she said, her eyes shining. Would you thank him for me? Relieved, Maureen smiled back. I'd be happy to. The hardest part of their punishment turned out to be cleaning the garage. It wasn't all that messy, but it was so cold in the garage that Vernon just couldn't stay warm while working. They had to use a lot of bleach and air fresheners to remove the cat smells. Even with Holly's helping, it was slow going. Vernon was glad when the garage was finally finished to Dad's satisfaction. That left a couple of free days before Vernon had to pack his things and get ready to go back to school. Then it snowed again. It wasn't as much as before, but Mum insisted the two go out and shovel all the driveways and sidewalks again. Mum was still mad about the break-in. Vernon was really glad when it was time to return to Smeltings. Perhaps he'd finally get a chance to get some rest.